Now, Peter Wertheim, the co-CEO of the Executive Council of Australian Jewry. Now, you're arguing this watered-down hate speech bill from the federal government, which of course was a long time coming, doesn't go far enough. You say that the wording of the proposed legislation doesn't include enough forms of hate speech. Explain what is your issue with the current state of the legislation.
Well, I take my yardstick or starting point with some of the events that have occurred in recent times. Cast your mind back to last year, October the 9th, 2023, when we had a major demonstration at the forecourt of the Opera House. The rhetoric was violent. The behaviour was menacing and intimidating. In keeping with that rhetoric, I would have thought that, judging by the reaction to it, including on Sky News, which did a big expose of that whole incident, people would have expected that that kind of conduct would already be against the law and should have been prosecuted. And yet there was no prosecution, there was no legal action taken in relation to it at all. So I guess our starting point has to be, do we believe that behaviour in that category should be prosecutable? And if the answer is yes, then we have to gauge any potential legislation against that sort of behaviour and see whether it would be prosecutable under that legislation. And the current bill does not have a provision in there which would enable a prosecution of that sort of behaviour to occur.
So at the moment, the bill is basically suggesting that anything that is a direct incitement to violence, i.e. you are suggesting someone should do something, would be considered hate speech, but perhaps a more indirect version of incitement to violence would not be included. Is that correct?
I think that's the way it's advertised. The difficulty with this sort of legislation, Caleb, is that it's not always as advertised. The use of the word incitement has a particular meaning in common parlance. Most people would have thought that the behaviour we saw at the Opera House forecourt would have fallen within the meaning of incitement. And yet the legal meaning is much narrower and much more constricted. It's quite technical. I can get into the weeds of it if you like, but it doesn't necessarily correlate to the way most people use the word incitement in common parlance. And so for that reason, when you use the word incitement as the test for whether it's incitement to violence or even incitement to hatred, in the criminal context where you have to prove intention to incite beyond reasonable doubt, you're setting a very high bar, and a bar which most prosecutors find impossible to overcome. And that's the reason why the sorts of behaviours that we've been discussing have gone unpunished.